to the fourth episode of Unfamiliar Territory. I'm joined by my co-host, Callie Heis.
Hello, everyone.
And this week we have our first guest on the podcast, Raptor56.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And this week we're going to be talking about his version of familiars, Rainbow Familiars. So, Raptor, do you want to talk about who you are and how you got into familiars?
So, I would consider myself, a Pauper aficionado. I first got into the format around Eldrazi Winter, when the modern format was kind of rendered unplayable for a while. And during that time period, I sort of fell in love with the format, and I continued playing it ever since. In terms of familiars, I would say the first sort of familiar that I got into was kind of, not traditional. It was a Walls familiar deck. It was playing cards like Acme Guardian, and Sunset Familiar, along with like Free from the Real and stuff like that. So it was, a very unique version of familiars. But then once I kind of saw the power that came with the card Sunset Familiar, I eventually kind of branched into other directions, and I've tried things like blue-white familiars, Jeskai familiars, Esper, and so on.
So, you got into wall familiars, and how did you transition from that into rainbow familiars, or like how did you make the deck?
So yeah, that's a really good question. So Rainbow Familiars actually came from the Peasant format. So for those who are unaware, Peasant is pretty similar to Pauper, but the main sort of difference between the two is that Peasant allows for there to be 5 uncommons in your list, and also the ban list is a little bit different. But there was a list that was being played in Peasant called, I think it was like Blue Green Ghostly or something like that, but it played the card Eternal Witness along with things like Cloud of Fairies and Ghostly Flicker, and instead of playing familiars to kind of help ramp, it played cards like Utopia's Sprawl and Wild Growth, and so the idea is you would put all these sort of enchantments on your lands, so that way they tap for, 2, 3, 4, ridiculous amounts of mana, and then with the card Cloud of Fairies and Snap, you could generate copious amounts of mana, and then eventually you'll get an Eternal Witness in play along with Ghostly Flicker, and you can have infinite mana, and then from there you can win the game in a million different ways. And so when I first played it in Peasant, I thought, this is awesome. Is there a way I can try it out in Pauper? And so that was sort of the main inspiration for the deck, and I continued kind of working on it ever since then, and eventually I was able to kind of get a working variation and kind of work it into Pauper, so to speak.
So, let's talk about your first iteration of the deck. Looks like there's a lot of different cards here than you have now. So, do you want to go and talk about your card choices here and why they're there?
So, the first iteration, it was still trying to mimic the original blue-green list, and one of the main sort of differences is that it's playing the card Pespermite, which I no longer play. And another thing is that it was playing the card Artem's Astrolabe, and that card was sort of what made me look back into the archetype, because initially when I was playing it, it was purely blue-green. There was no other colors in it, and I found that it was too difficult to actually combo if you weren't playing cards like Sunset Familiar. And so when Artem's Astrolabe was printed, I realized that it basically made, splashing white or any other color for that matter, trivial. It costed you nothing. And so I was playing 4 copies of Pespermite to try and mimic Cloud of Fairies. It's not as busted as Cloud of Fairies, but it can still untap the land, so if you can Ghostly Flicker it, you can basically get infinite mana, provided you have the right setup. And so the idea was that instead of playing Eternal Witness and Cloud of Fairies, I would play Archaeomancer and Pespermite. And then, with Artem's Astrolabe, I could play cards like Ephemerate and Sunset Familiar, and I basically have all these ways to sort of have every color imaginable, but also I can sort of, generate a ton of mana very quickly and try and combo up as soon as possible. So that was sort of the inspiration for the original list, was to try and mimic the version in Peasant. So I would probably say that the biggest sort of differences between the older versions and the newer versions are, one, they're playing Art and Fastballade, which is no longer legal, and also it was playing Testamite, which is not really that good, especially when I eventually realized that Archaeomancer plus Snap was just a better way to generate infinite mana than to even use Testamite. So that's one of the main, I guess, difference between the first generation and some of the newer ones.
So Raptor, since Arkham's Astrolabe got banned, there's a little bit of time when we didn't see this pop up. And then you were qualified for the format championships, and you ended up in the finals, I believe, with a deck nobody expected, which is
Correct.
another iteration of this. But, you can't play Astrolabe, so what did you do to make it work?
So the original idea was, if I can't play Astrolabe, I might as well try and look into the next best option, which is Prophetic Prism. And one of the things I found out in playing this archetype is that, one, Pestamite is not really needed. It turns out that Archaeomancer and Snap is, one, it's more efficient than Pestamite, and two, it is just faster and better than Pestamite. And so I realized that Pestamite's no longer a necessity, and I actually cut all 4 copies, and that helped enable the deck to have more slots so it could play other cards. Additionally, since I wasn't playing Art and Fastballade, I could just play Prophetic Prism, and so it wasn't really losing that much in the grand scheme of things. Not to mention, when you look at the era of Art and Fastballade, a lot of the top decks at the time were playing Art and Fastballade alongside Prophetic Prism. And so when they lost Art and Fastballade, they didn't really have anything to replace it with because they were already playing Prophetic Prism. And so they kind of got screwed over in that regard because they had no follow-up. Whereas this particular iteration of Rainbow Familiars, I was playing the card Abundant Growth with Art and Fastballade. And what I realized is that Abundant Growth, in a sense, is sort of like, I guess, a more fair version of Art and Fastballade, because, sure, it costs green mana, but it's still it only costs 1 mana as opposed to 2, and I still have another backup, which is Prophetic Prism, so I can just play Abundant Growth and Prophetic Prism, and I'm not really losing that much. So I have to play both of those to kind of help fix up the mana, and because I wasn't playing the card Pestamite anymore, I have to make, more slots, and I basically have to add some new cards to the archetype. So I think the first thing I added was 1 copy of Reaping the Raves over a Pulsar, and I also added, since I cut the 4 Pestamites, I believe I added some copies of Moment Piece, and I think I added a couple copies of Flicker and some more counter spells. And I think I also upped the land count from 16 lands to 18 lands. So I think those were some of the main additions to the newer version. I should probably specify as well that the reason why I made some of those choices was because I didn't really know what to expect for the Pauper Championships. Like, I had a good feeling that it was probably going to be Tron heavy, but there were still a number of wild cards in the field, so I wanted to have some cards in the main board to kind of help deal with that, so that's why I added cards like Moment Piece, and just to kind of have ways to, you know, deal with some of the aggressive decks, and I also had Reaping the Raves, because that card is actually really, really powerful against some of the more counter-heavy archetypes, things with, tons of counter spells. It kind of negates all of that because it has Storm, so it can just get back all of your creatures.
If anybody doesn't know, can you just go over how you make infinite mana in this list?
Oh yeah, we can talk about that. So I should probably specify that. So the idea is you want to count to the number 7. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. So let's pretend, for example, I have the card Archaeomancer in my hand and the card Snap in my graveyard. So for the sake of discussion, let's pretend I already have infinite mana. I can cast Archaeomancer, then I can target the Snap in my graveyard and return it to my hand. Then I can cast Snap on my Archaeomancer, return it to my hand, and now I'm back to where I'm starting. Archaeomancer's in my hand, Snap is in my graveyard. So we can see that I can do that forever if I have infinite mana, but if I don't have infinite mana, then that's not possible. But there are ways to make that work, and it will lead to infinite mana. So if you look at the card Archaeomancer, it costs 4 mana, and the card Snap costs 2 mana. So, for example, if I had 2 lands in play, and they both tapped for a total of 7 mana, then I could do that iteration, and I would net 1 mana for each iteration, because I tap both lands for 7 mana, then I would play Archaeomancer, I have 3 mana left, then Archaeomancer targets my Snap, I return that to my hand, then I play it on Archaeomancer, then I return Archaeomancer, untap both my lands, and I have 1 mana left over. So I can do that forever, and now I have infinite mana. Additionally, if I have a Sunscape Familiar in play, that becomes much easier as well. Because now, let's say I have 2 lands that tap for, say, 5 mana, and I have a Sunscape Familiar in play. Sunscape Familiar reduces the cost of blue spells by 1 generic mana. So now, Archaeomancer, instead of costing 4 mana, it costs 3, and Snap, instead of costing 2 mana, it only costs 1 mana. So now, instead of having a combined total of 6 mana, it's now a combined total of 4 mana. And so now you can kind of see, since I have 2 lands that tap for 5 mana, and the total cost for a loop is 4 mana, I can do it forever and generate infinite mana. So there's tons of different combinations that can generate infinite mana. Another one is that you have like 2 familiars in play, and 2 lands that tap for a total of 4 mana, provided there's at least 3 blue mana. That's another way to go infinite. There's tons of different combinations, but the main criteria, and I guess the main sort of enablers, are 1, Sunscape Familiar, 2, just bounce lands, things like Azorius Chancery, which is a land that taps for multiple mana, and then lastly, things like Utopia Sprawl and Fertile Ground, both of which enable lands to tap for multiple mana. And I guess also Abundant Growth, which allows for the land to tap for mana of any color, so that way you'll have enough blue mana to go through a particular iteration of a loop. So that's sort of the general idea of getting infinite mana. There are also ways to convert infinite mana to infinite blue mana, because at the end of the day you want to have infinite blue, but there's a couple different ways to do that as well.
Alright, so it's been about 6 months since your champs list. There's a lot of different changes here. Do you want to discuss those changes and why you chose those?
So some of the changes from the champs list to the more recent one, I guess the first point of discussion is the mana base. So the champs list, it was playing 18 lands, and the bounce land of choice was Simic Growth Chamber, and in the newer iterations, I'm now playing 19 lands, one of which is a Plains, so that way I can fetch white mana to cast my Sunscape Familiar if I need to do that. And I also replaced the Simic Growth Chamber with Azorius Chancery. So, for those who are unaware, a bounce land is basically a land that taps for 2 mana. Typically, some combination of the Ravnica, Guild Pack colors. So the Simic one tapped for blue and green, and the Azorius one, which is in the most updated version, taps for blue and white. So that way I can have more white sources for Sunscape Familiar. So that's sort of the first update. The second update is that I eventually cut Prophetic Prism, and the reason why I did that was for a couple of reasons. The first was that I wanted to make room for other cards, and I eventually realized that Prophetic Prism probably had to be removed. And the other was that I don't think it's like super necessary, because once I added Azorius Chancery, I gave myself another out to convert infinite white mana into infinite blue mana. We'll talk about that later, but once I figured that out, I realized that Prism was no longer necessary. And also, I've realized the card Fertile Ground, which is similar to Utopia Sprawl, but it costs 2 mana, and it can target any land instead of a forest. Fertile Ground was just better than Prophetic Prism because it still helps ramp you, and I thought that was pretty important because I found that games where I had Prophetic Prism were not that like drastic or that different, but the games where I had a Utopia Sprawl were just astronomically different. Like every game you had turn one Utopia Sprawl into, turn 2, 3 mana play or something. Those were some of like the most must-win games because you could heal very quickly and just combo off extremely fast. And so I wanted to try and enable that and play more copies of Utopia Sprawl, so I played Fertile Ground, which is the next best option.
That makes sense. I was thinking with the Prophetic Prism, you had an infinite draw engine with the like Flicker, Mancer, and Prophetic Prism. But then now in your new list, you've got Seagate Oracles to kind of do the same effect while also being something that's cost reduced by the familiar and a blocker. So I can see why you made that change.
Exactly. The reason that's actually a really good point as well is that C8 Oracle, it's really important, I think, in the current metagame to have blockers for things like Ninja of the Deep Hours, and Prophetic Prism doesn't do that, and C8 Oracle definitely does that, so I was definitely happy to get more copies on C8 Oracle over Prophetic Prism, so yeah, that's definitely a good point.
Plus, you can get it back with Reaping.
Oh yeah, exactly. And it combos with Snap, which I think is a pretty big deal because sometimes you'd have multiple copies of Snap in hand, and you wouldn't have a Moldifer, so you couldn't really do anything with Snap. But having more cards like Seat Oracle means that Snaps are just even better because you have more cards that you can just target your Seat Oracle and then replay it and net mana and just it gives you more targets, which I think is really important.
So we've talked about your uh, list progression. We haven't really talked about how the deck works and what the combos are. So do you want to go in depth and talk about those?
So once you have infinite mana, there's sort of a couple different ways to win, but the general idea is that you want to find the card Ghostly Flicker, and you also want to have an Archaeomancer in play, along with something like, Sleeping Oracle or Mold Drifter. So once you have infinite mana, typically it's going to be infinite blue mana. What you can do is you can cast the card Ghostly Flicker, targeting Archaeomancer and say like a Mold Drifter, and draw your entire library. Because Archaeomancer will get back the Ghostly Flicker, and then Mold Drifter will draw you 2 cards. And since you have infinite mana, you can do that over and over again until you basically have every card in your library is now in your hand. So there's sort of 2 ways to win from there. The first one is what you do is you just sort of play out all of your creatures. So you play out all your Moldiffers, all your Sea Oracles, all your Archaeomancers, and then you make sure your hand is something ridiculous like, 2 Ghostly Flicker, 2 copies of Prohibit, a Reaping Rains, and then 2 copies of Snap. And so that way you basically have the entire board under control because typically, once you have infinite mana and you have, all the cards in your library, you're going to, bounce your opponent's entire board with the card Snap. And then once you have all your creatures in play, you can just attack them over the course of several turns, and you'll eventually just kill them with, just combat damage. But there's also a second way to win, which is a little bit more time consuming, but sometimes it's required, and it involves the card Compulsive Research. So Compulsive Research is a 3-mana sorcery that says target player draws 3 cards, and then they can either discard a land or just 2 cards of any type. So what's important about that card is that it says target player. So what you'll do is you'll just get 2 copies of Archaeomancer in play, and then with Compulsive Research, you'll target your opponent, and so that way they have to draw 3 cards, and then you can cast Ghostly Flicker, targeting both copies of Archaeomancer. The first one gets back Compulsive Research, and the second one gets back Ghostly Flicker. And you just do this over and over and over again until your opponent basically mills out. And so this is important because there are some matchups where, maybe you're not able to let your opponent untap, right? Maybe you should just kill them on the spot. So it's not something you do all the time, but it definitely comes up. Additionally, there's another weird way to kill. It's not very common, but it does involve a sideboard card, which is Yuckshot. So it's Yuckshot is an instant that costs 1 red mana, but it's also like 1 Phyrexian red mana. And what this card says is it deals 1 damage to any target. And so typically once you have infinite mana, you can have infinite mana of any color. So you'll generate infinite red mana, and then instead of, casting Compulsive Research, you'll just Yuckshot your opponent a million times and deal infinite damage that way. So that's another way to do it. It's not super common, but it does come up. So those are pretty much the 3 sort of main ways to combo kill the opponent once you have infinite mana. Those are sort of like the 3 sort of end games from there. Is, draw your entire library, and then, kill them in one of 3 main ways.
So, Raptor, what keeps you from going off axis and running something like Weather the Storm and Epicure of Blood, and just generating Infinite Storm and then weathering with Epicure, or like playing something that could just bounce all the permanents, the guard with buyback? Why are you just trying to streamline and not add any spice to it?
So the reason why I want to streamline it is I don't want to have cards in my main board that are sort of bricks. What I mean when I say a brick is it's basically a card that does nothing until I have a specific scenario. A really good example is there's a deck in Legacy called Sneak and Show, and the idea is you want to basically play the card Show and Tell, which lets you put a creature from your hand into play. And so you'll put in like an Emerald Hull or a Grizzlebrand, and that will basically win the game on the spot. But the problem with that archetype is that, it's a very powerful combo, but if you draw multiple copies of Emerald Hull or multiple copies of Grizzlebrand, it feels really bad because unless you have a Show and Tell, they don't do anything. They just sit in your hand and they sort of rot away. And I kind of wanted to avoid that if possible. And the reason why I'm not playing something like, say, Capsize or like a Fireball or, anything like that is because if you don't have the combo in play, it doesn't really do anything. Like, sure, you might be able to just, capsize an opponent's creature or maybe hit like a bounce land or something, but other than that, it's not that, powerful. It doesn't really do anything. And the same is true with like a Rolling Thunder. It just sort of sits in your hand doing nothing until you have the combo. And so the ideal sort of scenario is that everything in your deck, it can be a combo piece, but it can also just do something else. And that's why I really like having Compulsive Research as my win condition, because sure, it can, basically mill my opponent, but at the same time, I can also just play it as a, card draw spell to try and find, important combo pieces, or maybe try and find, prohibits for, fallouts or whatever. So it can also be just a great draw spell, and I think that's really important when you try and build a sort of any combo deck, is you want to try and make sure that, your combo pieces are as flexible as possible, and we've seen that throughout the history of Magic as well. There's decks like Splinterfin, for example, where, one of the things that made that deck so powerful in Modern was the fact that it could just play a fair game. It didn't need to combo. And so there were times where you would just, play cards like Testamite or Deceiver Exort to try and tap your opponent out of playing a spell they might want to play. Or sometimes you'd play a Splinter Twin on like a Snapcaster Mates to get, infinite Snapcasters. And so there was a lot of utility in the fact that it could be a combo piece, but it could also just do something else that's, equally as impactful in the game. And if you can do both of those things, I think it's just astronomically better than having, something like a Fireball or a Capsize, which can sometimes just have no text on it at all. So that's sort of the main reason why I'm not playing those cards.
Yeah, you're making me rethink playing Sage's Row Denizen in blue-white. But I tried to make infinite mana in blue-white, and it took me 6 minutes.
No, I definitely think, like, Sage's Row Denizen is a viable card to play, because on Magic Online, generating infinite mana with the blue-white version is extremely difficult. I think sometimes you have to make a concession to Magic Online, so I definitely understand that. I think that's definitely appropriate, but with Rainbow Familiars, I don't think it's necessary, so that's why I choose not to do it.
Is that why you like playing this list specifically? Because you can generate infinite mana and do even more crazy things, and it's not a time constraint?
Oh yeah, I think that's like one of the main, I guess, draws to this list is that when it wins on every axis. It doesn't, you have all the cards, you have, sometimes you have infinite life, infinite damage, you have everything. So, if that's what you like, it definitely satisfies that. So, it's
That's
definitely
awesome.
fun.
So on the topic of Capsize, I know you used to play it in familiar walls, and I still play it mostly for the reason that you can bounce everything they have, and then it saves you a lot of time. So it usually takes like 2 to 3 minutes to just bounce their board on Magic Online. But here you have Snap, which pretty much negates the entire reason of Capsize.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I said with Snap, it looks like you can just return one creature, but in reality, it's kind of just bounce their entire board, and you can win with Muldrifters there. Do you want to talk about how that combo works in this shell at all?
Oh yeah, sure. So basically, once you have drawn your entire library, what you'll do is you'll get 2 copies of Archaeomancer in play, and then with the first one, you'll have Snap targeting an opponent's creature, and then with Ghostly Flicker, you'll flicker both copies of Archaeomancer, pick up the Snap from your graveyard as well as the Ghostly Flicker with, the 2 Archaeomancers, and then you'll snap something else. And because, Snap is untapping lands and you basically have infinite mana at this point, you can do that forever. And so, for however many creatures your opponent has in play, you can just bounce all of them to their hand. And then, you'll probably have a couple Moltnifters in play, maybe a Seeping Oracle here and there. And then since your opponent has no creatures in play, and your hand is like multiple copies of Snaps, Ghostly Flickers, Prohibits, and like a Reaping the Graves. If they play anything the following turn, you can just snap it again and return it to their hand. Or what you can do is you can just cast Prohibit and basically counterspell it, provided it costs less than 5 mana. And so that way you can basically either prevent them from resolving their creature, or if it does come into play, you can just bounce it immediately with the card Snap. And so basically, no matter how many creatures they play, by their end step, you'll just return it all to their hand, and so then that way the following turn, I can just, attack with all my creatures, and then do it again the following turn, rinse and repeat, and then, over the course of several turns, you'll probably deal lethal damage just by attacking with your creatures.
Yeah, and it's important to note for the listeners that the infinite snap only costs 5 mana. You don't have to have infinite mana for that to work. So you need your 3 mana flicker and 2 mana for snap, as long as your 2 lands tap for 5, or you have cost reduction.
That's really important to note as well, because there are some spots where you don't have infinite mana, but you do have that particular interaction in play. So that's definitely a good thing to note that I did not mention, but that's really important, because sometimes, like, I'll have games where I'm like against an elves opponent, and they'll have like a giant board in play, and if you can get that combo online, you basically just have a one-sided upheaval, and that can just win the game on the spot.
So we talked about the combos of the deck, and we talked about the deck in general. So what are these? What are the hands that you want to keep, or the hands that you want to mulligan?
So in terms of the hands that you want to keep and the hands that you want to mulligan, my my sort of rule of thumb is that first off, I guess this is sort of common sense, but you want to make sure you can cast your spells, right? So if you have a hand with no lands, obviously I'm not going to keep it. If it has, like, say, one bounce land in it and no other lands, I'm not going to keep it. But assuming you have like a functional hand, the things I'm looking for are some amount of card draw, whether it's a Studian Oracle, a Mold Rifter, Compulsive Research, you know, a Preordain, Abundant Growth, something that in that area, as well as some amount of, ramp, whether it's a Sunscape Familiar, a Utopia Sprawl, a Fertile Ground, or even like a Bounce Land or a Snap or something like that. So that way you can sort of get the engine going as soon as possible. You can start, you know, generating extra mana with your, land enchantments, like with Utopia Sprawl and Fertile Ground, or even just something like Sunset Familiar. And then also you can just start drawing cards through your library with things like Moldifer and Oracle. And so both of those things are pretty important. I don't think I have like a strict rule on any particular combination of cards, but I'm just looking for something with like a mix of those. That's definitely something I would keep. At least for like pre-board games. When it comes to like sideboard games, it becomes a totally different thing. But when it comes to like game one, I'm usually just looking for a healthy mix of stuff like that.
I think we talked about how the deck is different than blue-white familiars, and it kind of attacks on a completely different axis. Do you think that because this deck can make infinite mana, it's like more consistent or less consistent than blue-white familiars? Or do you like playing it just because it has the infinite everything endgame?
So I think a really good analogy is if you look in Legacy, there's a format in Legacy called ANT, which stands for Ad Nauseam Tendrils, and there's another format called TESS, which stands for the Epic Storm. I guess if you don't play Legacy, those names are not super descriptive, but the general idea is that Ad Nauseam Tendrils, the first one, is a bit slower than the Epic Storm, but the trade-off is that it's a lot more consistent and it's a lot more resilient. And the Epic Storm, on the other hand, is a lot more explosive, right? It can kill on turn one a lot, I would say more often than Ad Nauseam Tendrils. However, it's less resilient to certain forms of hate, and it can sometimes be a little less consistent because of the particular build. And so I would say that analogy applies to the familiars Depths and Pauper. Blue-white familiars is, in my opinion, a lot more consistent, a lot more sturdier. It's playing cards like Jan Pharaoh's Faithful. It can play Stonehorn or Prismatic Strands on the main board. It also just has Mystic Sanctuary, which is a very powerful card. So in terms of all of those cards, it's a lot more stable and I would say resilient because of all those spells. Um, it's less explosive than Rainbow Familiars, but I think the fact that it's more resilient and more consistent is a pretty big advantage that it has. Whereas Rainbow Familiars, it's extremely explosive. I think it can kill as early as turn 3 or turn 4. So it definitely has, some of these insanely fast, nut draw hands where it just killed my opponent on turn 4. But the trade-off for that is that it can sometimes be a little less consistent. Sometimes you just draw, you know, a ton of, ramp spells, right? A ton of things like Utopia Sprawl, Sunscape, Fertile Ground, but you find no payoff, right? Or sometimes you find all your payoff, but you don't have any ramp spells, and so you become a little bit clunkier. So I would say I don't think one is necessarily better than the other in that regard, but I do think they sort of have different pros and cons to them.
I also, when I started picking up Rainbow to try to play it and get some leagues and understand it, I felt like my head was going to explode trying to keep track of all the things that were going on. So that might keep some people off the deck.
Yeah, the learning curve for it is like super steep. It's not something I would like recommend to people who are sort of new to Popper or who are trying to, learn the format. I think if you want to play it Harmonet, blue-white familiars is definitely the way to go. But I think once you get some experience with that, Rainbow Familiars is definitely something worth looking into. It's super fun, and if you're interested in decks like Clan Ironworks or, weird harmonics like that, Rainbow Familiars definitely has a similar play pattern to it, so if that's down your avenue, you might like Rainbow Familiars as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's probably the familiars deck that makes me think the most, for sure. Because with blue-white familiars, you just do, like, all these things and try to set up your combo. But with Rainbow, you have to think about, oh, should I do this or that? And then try to assemble every piece, as there's, like 5+ cards that you need to look for.
So I think next we want to probably talk about the sideboarding, and I don't think we need to go into a full sideboard guide because that would take 2 or 3 hours, but let's go ahead and, Raptor, if you would kind of give us an overview on what cards you cut in specific matchups, and then maybe also like what the sideboard cards are good against.
Alright, so in terms of cards that I would remove from the main board, it typically consists of the following. Fertile Ground, the 2 copies of Fertile Ground I'll definitely remove in certain matchups because I don't need the extra ramp. I'm expecting a bit of a longer game, so having sort of a quick, fast kill is not really necessary, so I'll cut Fertile Grounds for sure. Reaping the Graves is a card I will cut on occasion against, say, something like Modules or Elves, which both of those decks don't really play a ton of removal. I guess Modules now has Ram Through, so that is something to consider, but besides that, any sort of fast linear deck that doesn't have removal, I'll definitely take that out. Mystical Teachings is another card I will take out as well. Some matchups you just don't really need it, especially if you're taking out cards like Reaping the Graves. You kind of lose some incentive when you're taking out all the sort of silver bullets that go along with it. Another thing I'll take out is cards like Prohibit. Prohibit in some matchups is just not really useful. Sometimes your opponent is playing a very fast linear deck, and having a counterspell just really doesn't do anything, especially when they can play out their hand so quickly. And let's see, what else? Sometimes I will shame on snaps. Typically, the most I'll remove is like 1 copy, but sometimes, like say against Modules, for example, the card is not super impactful, so I'll remove 1 copy of that. Sometimes I'll cut Compulsive Research versus some of the more, grindy matchups or more aggressive decks. Really, it just kind of depends on what I'm feeling. And then I guess the last card I'll cut is Seeking Oracle. The main benefit of Seeking Oracle is that it's a really good blocker, and it's also just some nice card advantage. But once again, there are some matchups where, like, say, Burn, for example, your opponent is not really attacking on an axis where blocking is super critical. I think the only card they have is Llama Runner, which is only a 4 of. So blocking's not going to be super important in that matchup. So sometimes I'll cut like a Seeking Oracle, to try and add some counter spells or something like that. So that's sort of what I would look in the main board. Honestly, I'll be 100% transparent. My sideboarding with this deck is not super consistent. Sometimes, depending on how I feel, I might try something out, try something new. That's probably not like ideal, but it's just kind of a strange deck, and I'm still learning new things, the more I play with it. So that's sort of what I look at for the main board.
Yeah, I think the hardest part about this is that right now you're really the only person running the deck and kind of like headlining it. So you're the one making all the decisions and all the changes. But then when I was working on blue white familiars, we've got a lot of people kind of like in the weeds thinking about it and trying to figure out how to work it. Plus, there's not a lot of options. Here we have 5 colors. Your sideboard can get a little crazy.
I was going to say, no, exactly, because since I'm like one of the only, few people playing it, and the net is like, I would say far from being sort of streamlined or, mainstream, um, it's difficult to know if what I'm doing is like 100% correct. So that's sort of why I like to move around and try different things, because maybe I'm missing something, maybe there's something that I wasn't aware of. So sometimes I'll just try new things out just to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I really appreciate you getting into the weeds about what you're taking out and why, because that really allows people to play with that. Because like I never really thought about why would I want to remove fertile ground and taking out teachings if you remove the reaping the graves, because you're removing your silver bullet and stuff like that. So that's super helpful. And then one of the sideboard cards that I have seen you play, but not in the list I'm looking at right now, is Mystic Remora. Can you talk about how to effectively use this card?
So Mystic Remora is. I remember when that card first was introduced to the format during the Pauper unification. It was one of the cards that a lot of people were excited about, myself included, because I thought it would be super powerful. But I think like about a month or two passed, and it wasn't really doing anything. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that cumulative upkeep is a pretty serious drawback. And the decks that I was playing with it in, it typically did not have excess mana. And so one of the things that makes Rainbow Familiars really nice is that you have a ton of mana ramp. You have Moundsland, Sunscape Familiar, Utopia Scroll, Fertile Ground. You have a lot of ways to sort of, net excess mana. And that's sort of one of the reasons why Mr. Remora, I think, is even applicable in this particular archetype, because you tend to have a lot of excess mana. If you look in, say, Vintage, which is a format where the card has seen play in the past, that format also has a lot of excess mana in the forms of things like, Moxen, Black Lotus, Soul Ring, lands that produce extra mana and things like Tellurian Academy. There's lots of ways to sort of have extra mana to make the cumulative upkeep not really much of a drawback. And that's sort of one of the nice things that Rainbow Familiars has, is that you can actually have Mr. Remora in play and pay for the cumulative upkeep and still be able to play all your spells. You don't get into this weird spot where you have to like pay for Mr. Remora, but then you can't do all the things you wanted to do in the same turn. You can do both, which I think is a pretty powerful aspect of the card. In terms of the matchups that you bring it in, it was mostly brought in for the Delver decks, and I would probably say out of all the Delver variants, the blue-black Delver deck was probably the best one to bring it up against, and that's because they typically only have 12 or so threats. Irma, Angler, Delver, and Alter Bolas are sort of the main ones, and the rest of the list is cards like, you know, Brainstorm, Preordain, Tragic Lesson, Counterspell, removal spells. And so if you can run it out early and they don't have a threat in play, you can put them in a really awkward position, because if they want to play handprints to try and find a threat, they either have to, pay for mana or let you draw a card. So it can really sort of constrict your opponent. And then additionally, a really nice part about it is if you play it out, you can just start jamming your spells into, their counter spells or their removal, because if they counterspell it, so be it, you still have to draw a card. And if they kill your creature like, a Sunscape Familiar, that's fine with me because I'm still drawing a card. So all of a sudden, their sort of permission in counterspells and removal become sort of a lot less problematic. And I think that was really important, especially when we had cards like Mystic Sanctuary introduced to the format, because Mystic Sanctuary, along with cards like Tragic Lesson and Deprive, and sort of create these loops that are really hard to come out from under. And if you have a Mystic Sanctuary in play, it can make it a lot more feasible, because if they're depriving every turn, you're still drawing a card, so it's not that bad. And if they want a Tragic Lesson, you're also drawing cards, so it's not as one-sided as it would be. So it kind of helps deal with that aspect as well.
I just want all these ramp cards in all basics list so we can play Mystic Sanctuary too. The Mystic Remora just sounds really sweet in this deck.
Yeah, the way you explain it makes me want to play 4 now.
Oh yeah, that's definitely powerhouse.
I think like the list has evolved pretty well, and it's like very streamlined now. And the sideboard is just kind of like one of those things where you're like trying to meta a little bit, because you just have so many options. Would you still play Gutshot over something like Pyroblast, or are you just trying to be like as free spell as possible with those kinds of things?
So the reason why I'm playing Gutshot is because cards like Pyroblast tend to be a little bit more difficult to cast, especially now that I'm not playing the card Prophetic Prism. Before, when I was playing, 4 Abundant Growth, 3 copies of Prophetic Prism, red mana was not super difficult to come by, whereas now that I'm only really playing the 4 Abundant Growth and I guess 2 Fertile Ground, red mana can sometimes be a little bit difficult. You always do have the option of playing Utopia's Brawl, naming the color red, but typically you want to name blue if possible, but sometimes you do have to hit red. But I found that because I wasn't playing as many red sources as I had been in the past, Pyroblast started to become a little sort of less playable, because there were certain spots where I would have a Pyroblast, but I'd have no red mana at my disposal, and I just could not play it, and that was a pretty serious drawback. So once I sort of went in that direction, I cut the Pyroblast, and instead I played cards like Yuckshot. Yuckshot, what I like about it is that it can deal with a turn 1 Delver, which I think is pretty important, because that's definitely how some of the Delver decks can just win a game very quickly, is turn 1 Delver followed up by, a ton of permission. And additionally, I'm not playing, or instead of playing Pyroblast, I'm also playing cards like Counterspell, like actual Counterspell. And one of the benefits of that is that I found that there are certain matchups where people will have various forms of hate cards that you would otherwise have a difficult time dealing with. A really good example is versus some of the mono black decks, they'll born in land destruction, and Counterspell is a very clean way to stop them from blowing up my lands, whereas something like Prohibit it's a lot more difficult, because you would have to pay 4 mana instead of 2, and if they play it on turn 3 or something, it can be pretty backbreaking, whereas Counterspell is like a very clean answer, because, if they play it on turn 3 and you have Counterspell mana up, you can just cast it, whereas if you have Prohibit, you might not have the mana to play it with Kicker, so that's a pretty big deal. So, yeah, I think that's the main reason why I cut Pyroblast, is because once I cut Prophetic Prism, I found myself not really being able to cast it as consistently as I would like, and I also found that cards like Counterspell are actually really nice at just having a clean answer to various hate cards in the sideboard games.
Have you considered running Counterspell over Prohibit in the main then? And then opening yourself up a little bit more on the sideboard?
I actually have considered that, and I do wonder if maybe that's the correct thing to be doing. That's like one of the difficult things about this archetype, is that there's so many directions that you could take it. It's really hard to know which one's correct. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword in that regard, because in certain metagames, if you know what to expect, you can easily adjust the deck to be very well positioned against a certain field. But at the same time, if the metagame is very unknown, it's difficult to know which particular iteration is correct, because you have so many options at your disposal. I think the core of the deck is like only a handful of cards. Things like Utopia Sprawl, Abundant Growth, Sunset Familiar, Snap, things like that. Those are sort of the core of it, but the rest of it is kind of up in the air. I've tried things like Deep Analysis over Compulsive Research. I've tried things like Brainstorm over Preordain at certain points, or just Brainstorm in addition to Preordain. There was another player who I worked on the list with, the Method Man. When we were working on it, he also had a couple different iterations. I know at one point he was playing Reign of Revelation in the main board over one copy of Compulsive Research, because that way you could have a hard advantage spell that you could find with mystical teachings. So there's lots of different ways to take the deck. I know your original question was about counterspell in the main board, but honestly, I'm not quite sure. I think it's definitely worth trying out though, for sure.
Yeah, I find that when you have a lot of options, it makes you kind of have problems because you start metagaming for a certain thing and then you run into the leagues and it's different, or you metagame for the leagues and you run at some big tournament and it's different. It's just kind of, I think Prohibit probably is one of those better catch-alls, but I was wondering if it was not a mana cost problem at that point, and then you could just play Counterspell and make it easier, or 1-1 or whoever. But it's cool to have all those options, and it gives you a lot of things to tinker with.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the only main benefit that Prohibit has over Counterspell is that if you have like a Sunscape in play, you can play Prohibit for 1 mana as opposed to 2 mana. So there is that benefit to it, but otherwise, I think Counterspell's definitely worth exploring for sure.
So, you've been tinkering with this list for a long time, but you also like to tinker with a lot of other stuff. Would you consider yourself a brewer, or do you just like moving on to the next thing because you get bored?
I would definitely consider myself a brewer. I worked on tons of different decks over my proper, I guess, I don't know what to call it, just career maybe. I'm not sure, but no, I definitely do think I'm a brewer for sure. Sometimes I'll work on something and it works and that's awesome, and then other times I'll work on a deck and I'll just be like, nah, it's not that great, and I'll just kind of have to put it on the shelf and then try and revisit it at another time. But it's all part of the process. But definitely a brewer for sure.
What's the next thing you're working on?
Uh, right now I'm working on Tron, which I know it's not super interesting, but we recently got the card Bonder's Ornament, and I'll actually have to thank Hallie guys for lending me his because I do not have any at the moment. But I think that card definitely has a lot of applications. Unfortunately, it's really expensive on Magic Online right now, but hopefully the price will, become more reasonable in the future. But I think that card has a lot of potential, and I've been trying it out in Tron, and I think it's really powerful. I've seen other people suggest playing it in things like a Jeskai build. I've seen people talk about it in land destruction. So I think that card has a lot of applications, and hopefully when we get more copies and it's more available, we can see some of the applications and ideas that people have for the card. But I would say right now it's definitely Bonder's Ornament, and currently I'm trying it out in Tron.
Well, you can try it out in Tron and then tell me how to beat it.
Yeah, I know Kung Fu Trees at the time of this recording has 3 5-0s with his Jeskai Ornament control list. So there's definitely a lot of things that you can do with Ornament that have yet to be discovered for sure.
Raptor, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
So I have a YouTube channel. The username is the username that I go by, Raptor56. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always message me on there, or if I make a video or something, you can write a comment and I'll probably see it. Uh, and also probably the main area to find me is just on Discord. The username is still Raptor56, but I'm currently in the Familiar Discord. So if you want to reach out to me there, it's definitely a great spot to find me at.
So if you want to see more of his content and more in-depth discussions about Rainbow Familiars, you can go check out his channel. He has multiple videos there where you can see how to play the deck and what cards you can play and so on and so forth. Thank you everybody for watching this episode of Unfamiliar Territory. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. We will see you all in a couple weeks. See ya.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming on, Raptor. It's been awesome.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for explaining the most complicated Familiars deck ever.